You are no longer my son." Robert Carter's voice was cold, filled with disgust as he glared at Daniel. Daniel's chest tightened. He had expected his father to be angry, but not this. Sophie, the woman he loved, stood beside him, her hands trembling. She had known Robert wouldn't approve of their marriage, but she never thought he would go this far. "Father, please," Daniel said, his voice shaking. "I love her." Robert's laugh was bitter. "Love? Love is useless. Money is power. And you just threw it all away for some—" He glanced at Sophie. "Nobody." Gasps rippled through the large dining hall. Family members, business associates, and servants all watched in stunned silence. Robert turned his back. "From this moment on, you are dead to me." Daniel felt his heart break. He had lost everything, his family, his home, his wealth. But what Robert didn't know was that years later, life would teach him a lesson he would never forget. The Carter mansion was a symbol of wealth and power. Tall golden chandeliers hung from the ceiling, reflecting off the polished marble floors. Expensive paintings lined the walls, and servants stood quietly by, trained to never interfere. But tonight, the house was filled with something colder than luxury: judgment. At the head of the long dining table sat Robert Carter, a man in his late 50s, dressed in an expensive black suit. His piercing gaze could make anyone feel small. Robert wasn't just rich, he was powerful. A businessman who built his empire with strict rules and an iron will. To him, money was everything, and his biggest rule? No one defied him. But tonight, his own son had done just that. Daniel Carter, 28, stood at the other end of the room, his jaw clenched. He had grown up in wealth, surrounded by privilege, but his heart was different from his father's. And now? He was about to lose everything, all because he had married the woman he loved. Sophie Miller stood beside him, her head slightly lowered. She was not from wealth. She had grown up in a small home, worked hard every day, and knew the value of every dollar. She wasn't rich in money, but she was rich in kindness. To Daniel, that mattered more than anything, but to his father, she was a disgrace. The mood in the room was tense as business partners, family members, and servants watched in silence. Robert's voice cut through the air like a knife. "You humiliated me, Daniel. You had a future, a powerful one, and you threw it away for this girl?" Daniel stood his ground. "I love Sophie, and I won't abandon her just because you don't approve." Robert's face darkened. "Then you are no longer a Carter." Silence. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Daniel's mother, Evelyn Carter, placed a hand over her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. But she didn't speak. She never did against Robert. Servants lowered their heads, knowing there was no stopping this. Daniel had been erased from his father's world. Daniel stood frozen. His father's words echoed in his head. "You are no longer a Carter." He had expected anger, disappointment, but not this. His father had just disowned him in front of family, business associates, and servants. Sophie squeezed his hand, her fingers trembling. She knew marrying into a wealthy family would be difficult, but she had never imagined it would cost Daniel everything. Robert Carter, unshaken, picked up his glass of wine and took a slow sip. To him, this was over. But Daniel's voice was firm. If walking away from money is what it takes to be with Sophie, then so be it. Gasps rippled through the room. Robert set his glass down sharply. "Foolish boy." His voice was ice. "You think love will feed you? Shelter you?" Daniel didn't flinch. "We'll build our own life. I don't need your money." A cruel smirk formed on Robert's lips. "Then go. But don't come crawling back when life crushes you." Daniel's mother, Evelyn, let out a quiet sob. "Please, Robert. He's our son." Robert's expression didn't change. Not anymore. He turned to his butler. Remove his name from every record. As of this moment, Daniel Carter is a stranger. The butler hesitated. But Robert's cold gaze made him obey. Daniel's heart pounded. This was it. He had lost everything, his father, his inheritance, his entire world. But when he looked at Sophie, he knew he had made the right choice. He took a deep breath, and with one final look at his father, he turned and walked away. Sophie followed, tears streaming down her face. As they reached the door, Robert's voice echoed one last time, filled with arrogance. "You'll regret this." Daniel didn't turn back, because in his heart he knew one thing. One day karma would come, and his father wouldn't be ready for it. 10 years later, the Carter mansion was no longer a symbol of power. The once grand estate now looked hollow, empty halls, fewer servants, and a silence that echoed through its walls. And Robert Carter. He was no longer the man he once was. His once thriving business had collapsed. His investments had failed. His so-called loyal friends had abandoned him. His empire, gone. Now he sat alone in his study, flipping through old newspapers. On the front page was a name he had tried to forget. Daniel Carter, the rising business tycoon who built an empire from nothing. Robert's fingers trembled as he read the article. His son, the one he had disowned, humiliated, cast aside, was now one of the most respected entrepreneurs in the country. And beside him in the picture, Sophie. The very woman he had called a nobody. Robert's heart pounded. How had Daniel succeeded without him? How had the son he rejected become greater than him? A knot formed in his throat, and for the first time in his life, he felt regret. For weeks, Robert struggled. His wealth was gone. His health was declining. There was only one person left who could help him, the son he had thrown away. After days of hesitation, he finally swallowed his pride and drove to Daniel's estate. Robert stepped out of the old, worn-out car he had been forced to buy after losing his fortune. He looked up at the massive mansion before him. It was even grander than his own once was. Servants moved gracefully across the courtyard. The air was filled with laughter, life, and warmth. Everything he had lost. His chest tightened. He rang the doorbell. Moments later, the door opened, and standing there, dressed elegantly, eyes calm, was Daniel. For a long moment, father and son stared at each other. The last time they had spoken, Robert had disowned him. Now the power had shifted, and Robert knew it. Daniel crossed his arms. "Why are you here?" Robert's throat was dry. He never thought he'd have to say these words. "I need help, son." Daniel's expression didn't change. "Son," he repeated. Robert flinched. Daniel took a slow step forward. "The last time I saw you, I was no longer your son." Robert's lips parted, but no words came out. Because Daniel was right. He had erased him, and now the same son he had abandoned was the only person who could save him. Robert looked down. For the first time in his life, he felt small. "I was wrong," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "I was a fool. I see that now." Daniel studied him. His father, once so powerful, so untouchable, was now weak, desperate. Karma had done its work, and Daniel had a choice: to become like his father, or to be better. He inhaled deeply and made his decision. Robert Carter stood frozen. For the first time in his life, he had no control. The son he had disowned, humiliated, cast aside, was now the only person who could save him. Daniel stood at the doorway, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. Behind him, the house was full of life. The warm glow of chandeliers spilled into the night, laughter drifted from inside, and the sound of children playing echoed through the halls. It was the kind of home Robert had once taken for granted, But now, he was an outsider. Daniel's voice was calm, yet each word hit like a hammer. "You threw me away like I was nothing." Robert swallowed hard. There was no excuse for what he had done. "I know," he whispered, "and I regret it." Daniel didn't move. Did he care? Or had Robert truly lost him forever? Robert clenched his fists, the weight of his past pressing down on him. For decades, he had ruled with an iron fist. He had convinced himself that money was everything, that power was the only thing that mattered. And what had it brought him? A mansion that was now empty, business partners who turned their backs on him, friends who had only stayed for the wealth. His empire was gone, and so was his son. He had spent years mocking Daniel's choices, calling him weak for choosing love over money. But looking into his son's eyes now, Robert saw something he never had before: strength. Daniel was not the boy he had cast out. He was a man who had built his own legacy, without his father, without his fortune, without his name. And Robert had to face a truth that shattered him. Daniel had never needed him. But now, he needed Daniel. Daniel exhaled, looking past his father at the old, beaten car parked in the driveway. A far cry from the expensive chauffeur-driven vehicles Robert used to own. Daniel's voice was firm. "Why are you here?" Robert hesitated. For years, he had expected people to bow to him. But now, he was the one begging. His pride burned like fire, but he forced himself to say the words. "I need help, son." Daniel's face didn't change. "Son?" Robert's heart pounded, because he knew. The last time they had spoken, he had erased Daniel from his life. Now, Daniel was the one in control. "You didn't just disown me," Daniel said slowly. "You called my wife a nobody. You said I would come crawling back. And now look where we are." Robert's chest tightened. He was the one crawling now. Robert took a slow breath. The old him would have argued, blamed, made excuses, but he had nothing left to fight with. And for the first time, he truly saw what he had lost. "I was a fool, Daniel." His voice cracked. "I was blinded by greed. I thought I was teaching you a lesson. But life taught me one instead." Daniel didn't respond. He was letting him sit in his regret. Robert looked past him into the house, where Sophie stood quietly. She had heard everything, and Robert saw it. The pain he had caused her. He had called her a gold digger, a mistake, a disgrace. But now, she was standing in a home full of love, a home that she and Daniel had built without him. Robert's voice was barely a whisper. "I was wrong about you too, Sophie." She raised an eyebrow, arms folded. "Now you realize?" Robert felt small. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I am sorry." Sophie studied him for a long moment. Then she sighed, setting down a tray of tea on the table. "People make mistakes, but only if they learn from them does it matter." Daniel turned toward Sophie. She met his eyes. She wasn't vengeful, but she also wouldn't forget, and neither would Daniel. He looked back at his father. "I won't turn you away, Father," Robert exhaled sharply. Then Daniel added, "But I won't forget either." For a moment, Robert felt a pang of fear. Was this mercy, or was it punishment? Daniel stepped aside. "Come inside." Robert hesitated. Then, with shaking hands, he stepped into his son's home. A home built on love, respect, and everything money could never buy. And just like that, karma had come full circle. Robert stepped inside. The warmth of the house immediately felt foreign. The Carter mansion had been cold, silent, built for power. But Daniel's home, it was full of life. Children's laughter echoed through the hall. The aroma of freshly cooked food filled the air. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, making everything feel open, welcoming, peaceful. Robert had once believed money was the only thing that mattered. Now, he stood in a home built on something far greater. Sophie led them to the dining table, where the family had been eating before Robert arrived. Daniel's 2 children, a boy and a girl, looked up curiously. "Daddy, who is he?" the little girl asked, tilting her head. Daniel hesitated. What was Robert to him now? Before he could speak, Robert said softly, "I am someone who made a lot of mistakes." Sophie pulled out a chair for him. "Sit." Robert blinked in surprise. After everything, she was offering him a seat. His mind flashed back to that night 10 years ago, when Sophie had stood in his mansion, humiliated, while he had taken everything from her. Now, she had everything, and he had nothing. Slowly, he sat. Dinner resumed, but Robert barely touched his food. He watched as Daniel helped his son cut his food, as Sophie laughed softly as the children talked about their day. It was so normal, so full of love, and it was something he had never truly experienced. His own family dinners had been formal, distant, controlled. He had never truly listened to Daniel, never laughed with him, never been a father. And that was his real loss. Not the money, not the business. His biggest failure was losing his family before he even knew he had lost them. After dinner, Daniel walked him to the door. Robert turned to him, guilt heavy in his chest. "I don't deserve this." His voice was barely above a whisper. Daniel nodded. "Number you don't." Robert's heart sank. But then Daniel sighed. "But I won't be like you. I won't turn away family." Robert felt a lump in his throat. Daniel studied him for a long moment. Then he said something Robert never expected. "You can stay, but on my terms." Robert exhaled shakily. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't revenge. It was a second chance. One he never thought he'd get. Robert nodded. "I understand." And for the first time in his life, he was grateful for something money couldn't buy. As Robert settled into the guest room, he looked at the simple but cozy space. It was not a mansion, but it was a home. And finally, he understood the difference. He sat on the edge of the bed, running a hand through his gray hair. Everything had changed. He had changed. Because in the end, karma had given him exactly what he had given to others. And now, it was up to him to decide what kind of man he wanted to be. Robert Carter once believed wealth was everything. He disowned his son, humiliated the woman who loved him, and walked away without regret. But karma never forgets. Years later, he lost everything. His business, his money, his so-called friends, and the only person left to help him, the son he had abandoned. But Daniel Carter didn't seek revenge. He didn't turn his father away. Instead, he showed true strength. Because real power isn't in money. It's in kindness, in love, in family. So let's ask you, have you ever seen karma come full circle? Would you have helped Robert, or would you have turned him away? Let us know in the comments. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. For more powerful and eye-opening stories like this, hit that subscribe button now. Thank you for watching, and remember, what goes around comes around. Until next time.